Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Hail State Debate. It is September 2020 and we are setting off into the, uncharted waters of online debating, at least for this semester, hopefully for the only year we'll ever have to do it, because I know it's not ideal. But as we do that, at least we have a good Lincoln Douglas topic to make things a little bit better, and that is resolved in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. This is a topic they're bringing out of retirement from back in 2013 for another go round. And I think it's a good topic to do that with. I think it's one that's sort of evergreen and has a lot of different angles you can take on it. So we're going to talk about that in just one second. But first, obviously, we want this video to be as useful as possible to you. So as always, the sites and timestamps are going to be below in the notes. If you like and you want to get sort of our general thoughts and debate and little updates on the topic, you can follow us on Twitter at Hail State Debate. If it's useful, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend, because we want to help as many people as possible. And if you have novices debating the novice civil disobedience topic, we have a video on that. We've had it for several years. Feel free to send them over there to have a look at that. Lastly, I do apologize. This video is coming out a bit late. COVID-19 has wreaked havoc on everybody, and universities are no exception. My personal schedule has been just completely insane. Our schedule as a team has been insane. As you guys may or may not know, coaching is not my first job. My job is being an administrator and a lawyer here, and it's just been kind of crazy. So my apologies, but we'll be back on schedule, normal schedule, for the November-December topic, and from then on out, hopefully things won't be too crazy. But with that, just a few thoughts about the topic. The first one is you don't bring a topic back unless it's pretty good. We bring this one back from having its first go around in 2013. So there's going to be a fair bit of stuff out there for you to look at. You can go and Google a topic and find a good bit of information out there. I will say that the literature and certainly like the real world of politics have evolved since 2013. We're in a different world politically, and there's a lot more good literature, some empirical literature out there that you can find. One really, really good study from this year from the Brookings Institution that we're going to talk a lot about. So if you just went out and did nothing but looking at old cases and resurrecting them and going to your team's back files or whatever, you would not be well served. You would be somewhat out of date. You wouldn't have the latest and greatest. So use that stuff. It's great to start with, but don't base your entire advocacy around it. I'll also say I think this is a surprisingly deep topic. I think on the surface you've got like this sort of superficial idea of, well, is it okay to force people to do things they don't want to do for the greater good, right? And that's a theme that's going to come up again and again, but there are a lot of meta layers underneath or above, I don't know wherever you think of them, but around that central idea. Things like, just a few examples from my research. How do you measure the benefits of compulsory voting, right? Is having more turnout by itself enough? Or do we have to show that more turnout actually tangibly leads to better policy outcomes or different election results? Because that's a little bit harder. It's almost undisputable that there's more turnout and more turnout by marginalized groups and people who are typically underrepresented. That's very easy to show. Do you then have to show that that actually leads in countries that do compulsory voting to different or better policy outcomes? And if so, what does it mean to have a better policy outcome? That can become a pretty heavy burden in the limited amount of time you have to do your affirmative case if you believe that. But I actually think if you want to be set on the safe side, you probably do need to do at least some thinking about policy outcomes, right? Turning from the policy side to the more theoretical side, what are the philosophical and theoretical justifications for like forcing people to do things against their will? We don't do this generally. Most democratic societies, as a general rule, say that you make decisions about what you want to do with your time. The government doesn't interfere. Now, there are exceptions like jury duty. There are exceptions like mandatory school attendance laws, but we have some pretty strong philosophical and theoretical justifications. So we're going to talk about things like collective action problems and things like rational choice theory. We'll even look into maybe some paternal arguments that, well, all of the experts are telling you that even if you don't want to go vote, it's in your best interest, which is sort of like telling an adult that they need to go eat their vegetables. And so there are a lot of philosophical grounds that may or may not be particularly strong for why we're making this exception to our normal default rule that we generally don't force adults to do most things that they don't want to do. So why are we doing that, right? There are other issues, for example, like free expression. The freedom to speak entails the freedom not to speak. Are we forcing people to participate in an expressive process of voting that they don't want to against their will, right? That's a question that deserves attention. And then lastly, on a practical level, what exactly is compulsory voting anyway? There are so many different systems, a wide spectrum of exactly how compulsory they are. Do you actually have to impose tangible penalties? democracies? Can you just have a mandate and not enforce it, right? And there are going to be trade-offs in terms of costs and benefits there. But anyway, as you can see from just this sample, a lot of really great angles you can look at. Probably the reason why they brought it back. A lot of different strategic positions you can take that should make for a good diversity of debate. Last but not least, on the initial thoughts, I will say this. As different as all these angles are on the topic, the one thing we'll all have in common is, with the exception of a handful of folks, who might have done some debating last year at NSDA, the vast majority of us will be heading into online debating. Well, you will. I don't have to debate anymore. That's good. But the vast majority of folks will be heading into online debating for the first time. And just a few quick tips on that. Number one, take it seriously. The stakes are just as high. Your opponents are going to be just as prepared. The resume items and presumably the awards are going to be nice. You want to try to win those. In terms of specifics beyond just like taking it seriously, practice with the technology. Know how the Zoom meetings and things works. I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with that now. Half of you are probably going to school that way, but make sure you get in and are familiar with the technology. Do at least one online practice debate. Right? Don't let your first tournament debate be the first time you've ever tried to debate online. You're trying to get used to it. Get a solid microphone, right? If a lot of times your built-in mic on your laptop may not be super strong, and it's really important for the audio to be clear, especially in rounds that are going faster. Not saying go out and buy a microphone, but maybe consider borrowing one from your school if your audio is not great. So make sure you've got good, solid audio. Dress professionally. I know it's tempting to maybe sort of dress down because you're doing this from your bedroom or from some other place, but go ahead and put on the shirt, the tie, the jacket, whatever you normally would wear. It will not only impress it won't hurt you with anybody, right? There may be some judges that don't care, but there will be some judges who do care, so there's no reason not to, right? Get a good camera angle. The camera angle I've got right here, be perfect. If you can have something that you can mount a little bit higher, try not to have the one where it's like shooting up your nose on the laptop. Again, little subtle cues are important. Do a test where you record yourself speaking at that angle into the microphone, see how it looks, see how it sounds, get it the way you want it, right? Aesthetics, should they matter? Maybe not, depending on where you are and how you debate, but they do, right? And so do that. And then, of course, know the specific rules and expectations at the tournament. So if you're supposed to be there 5 or 10 minutes before the round starts, checking audio or whatever it is, whatever the rules are, read them and make sure you're ready. So with that, we got a good topic. We got a challenging semester. So let's jump right in and talk about first some definitions and framework, then some values and criteria, then our arguments on the AFF, then the NEG, then some final thoughts, and then we will be done. All right, so let's talk for just a second about definitions and framework. I think one of the big themes that's going to run through this resolution on the framework side of the debate is exactly how much leeway the affirmative has to sort of narrow the scope of the debate. I think it is entirely reasonable for affirmatives to want to try to narrow the scope of the debate because the two things we're talking about, democracies and compulsory voting, are both incredibly broad. Obviously, there are well over 100 democracies in the world, right? And they're historical democracies, right? But in addition, the idea of compulsory voting is something that has dozens of different forms and permutations. Multiple countries do it. Dozens of countries have done it throughout history, and they all take different approaches. Some are truly mandated and enforced. Some are not really enforced. Some are fairly draconian in their penalties. Many are very light in their penalties. Some have exceptions. Some have fewer exceptions, right? And so it is understandable that the affirmative doesn't want to have to defend, every single permutation of compulsory voting, and maybe that they don't want to have to defend it in every single democracy with every single different sort of historical reality and set of circumstances. And the question is, to what extent can they actually limit it? That's kind of the overriding theme. So let's put a pin in the question of which democracies do they have to look at, because that's going to depend on the phrase in a democracy. So before we get to that, let's first talk about, is it reasonable for the affirmative to want to run a specific advocacy on what type of compulsory voting you'll have? What specific version will you do? And I think broadly speaking, my answer to that as a matter of sort of basic debate theory would be yes. I think it is legitimate for an affirmative to pick a specific version of compulsory voting, for example, the Australian version or the historical version from Switzerland, or the version that's raised in the Brookings paper we're going to talk about later, the Lift Every Voice paper, which is just excellent. Pick your favorite version and run that. And here's why. Basically, because I don't think there's anything inconsistent with that approach and the language of the resolution. If the statement is voting ought to be compulsory, and you come up with a specific way in which it would be compulsory and that would be desirable, and the judge agrees that it's desirable, right, then you have proven the resolution a true statement, right? So for example, if we say we should go to a Chinese restaurant for dinner, and I advocate for a particular Chinese restaurant that's really good, and we go there and everyone enjoys it, right? Then in that case, I've met my burden, right? I don't have to advocate for every single Chinese restaurant, just we should go to one. And in that case, the statement we should go to a Chinese restaurant is true. Similarly, if the statement is voting ought to be compulsory, and I show you that there is one good system, and the judge agrees, then I think the burden is met, right, in that particular case. So I think the wording of this particular resolution is absolutely susceptible to a plan. Now, of course, you could get in some crazy debate theory stuff from like policy debate about what we call like hypothesis testing, I guess, where you have to prove that every single version would be good, every single version of compulsory voting. But hopefully, that doesn't happen a lot in the circuit where you debate. I know it doesn't happen in the circuits where I have judged, right? So I don't think that's going to be an issue. So I do think it's generally speaking going to be perfectly okay to pick an advocacy or a plan. Now, I recognize that in some parts of the country this is frowned on. Some circuits don't like it. Maybe you can soften it up a little by calling it an advocacy or a recommendation or a model or something like that as opposed to a plan. But as a matter of just like debate theory and fairness, I don't think there's anything wrong with picking the Australian model or whatever, right? And one big reason why you'd want to do this is the affirmative, picking out a particular advocacy or a particular version of compulsory voting, is because it lets you anticipate some of the key objections and sort of build around them. So for example, you say, well, I don't want to have to pick between two candidates I don't like. Well, good news, under my version, the Australian version, you can mark none of the above, or you can just return a blank ballot. You don't have to pick anybody you don't want. Oh, okay, well good, that helps you as the AF, right? I don't think I should have to be required to vote because I have religious objections. Well, good news, under this version that I'm running, you can be a conscientious objector, you can submit an affidavit, and you can get an exception, right? And this lets you have sort of real world answers that countries have come up with to real world problems. And I think that is a legitimate approach. I don't see any reason why you couldn't, right? So then moving on to talk about the actual, terms of the resolution, democracy I think is fairly straightforward. I know that some people try to be squirrely on almost every word of the resolution, but I don't think you get a lot of mileage on either side by trying to come up with really squirrely definitions of democracy. So I think the Webster definition of just a government in which supreme power is vested in the people directly or indirectly through a system of representation, something like that, some basic definition should be perfectly serviceable. I don't see a lot of, reason to try to fight over that. But that's the word democracy, right? I think much more debatable and maybe much more important for framing the resolution is the overall phrase in a democracy, because I think that helps determine whether or not the affirmative can pick a specific country. Can they run a case based solely on compulsory voting in one particular democracy? Now, the first blush interpretation on that would be, well, it says a democracy. A is singular. It's not all democracies. So yes, you should be able to go pick Japan or France or Germany or wherever you want to, pick a specific country, the United States, right? And just advocate for it there. Now, obviously, that's a tremendously difficult burden for the negative to anticipate all of those, right? And I think if you look more closely at the structure of the resolution, I come down on the side of saying that that actually isn't a legitimate approach, because the structure of the sentence, the phrase in a democracy, is what we call a generic noun phrase. And you guys know I tend to sort of nerd out on these sort of linguistic interpretations, but I think they're kind of important. So if you want to learn about what a generic noun phrase is, we're going to drop a link to an article by Susan Gelman from the University of Michigan, and she'll talk all about these canons of linguistic interpretation, and you can learn it. But right, the short version is this. A generic noun phrase is a noun that refers to a class of things, and it can be plural, it can be singular, it can have a definite article, which is the, it can have an indefinite article like a. But the thing all of these generic noun phrases have in common is that in the context of the sentence where they appear, it is clear that they are referring to a class of things from the context and not to an individual single thing. And let me give you an example. If I come up to you and I say, I do not own a car, which of these two interpretations is accurate? The first interpretation would be, I am saying I don't own anything that fits in the category of a car. I have no possession that would fit within the definition of the term car as we understand it. Or alternatively, would you think I was saying, well, there is a car I don't own, right? There's at least one car I don't own, but there may be other cars that I do own. right? Well, that's an absurd interpretation. You think I'm saying the first one. I'm saying I don't own anything that fits in the category of a car, right? Because I'm using a generic noun phrase, right? So the question for the phrase in a democracy is the same thing. In the context of this resolution, is it referring to like one democracy, pick your favorite democracy? It can be any democracy you want, like one car, pick whatever car you want and you don't own it, right? Or alternatively, is it just a way of referring to democracies as a class? And I think the only way you can answer that is by looking to how a normal reader would interpret it. So how would they do that? Well, like if I said in a restaurant it's okay to throw your food on the floor, most people would say no, that's not true. Now, can I name a single restaurant where it is? Yes, I can. Texas Roadhouse. If you've ever been to one of them while you're on a debate trip or anywhere else, you know it is okay to throw your peanuts on the floor. You can toss the shells on the floor after you eat them, right? And that's fine. But as a general statement, in a restaurant, it's okay to throw food on the floor. Most people would say that's false because it's not inviting you to pick a restaurant. It's saying in restaurants as a category, right? That's what that phrase means. So I think there's a very strong argument that in a democracy is a generic noun phrase that serves to describe a class of countries. And as a result of that, I don't think it's legitimate for you to just pick one. I think what it's saying is in the universe of countries that meet the definition of a democracy, this is what you should do. You should do compulsory voting. Now, is this debatable? Highly. It's absolutely debatable, but this is the debate you're going to have if somebody runs a single country, right? So moving on to the definition of voting, the bottom line here is that voting is incredibly broad. There's like 12 definitions of it under Webster, ranging from like opinion polls all the way to formal political voting. Obviously, if we tried to interpret it as like being required to respond to Gallup opinion polls, that would be absurd. So I think actually defining the word voting is probably not the way to go on this. The better approach for me would be to just take the phrase compulsory voting as a term of art and look for definitions of that phrase together. It's always good to prefer definitions as a term of art when we know that that is what the resolution is referring to. Now, I know in this case, the resolution doesn't actually put compulsory voting together. It doesn't have the two of them literally together in the resolution, but it's abundantly clear that that is what the topic committee meant. It's talking about compulsory voting, not like being compelled to like vote for class president or being compelled to vote when Gallup calls you on the phone and asks you your opinion, right? So I think, in terms of definitions for the term of art compulsory voting, there's a good one from FindLaw, which is a pretty reputable legal search company, and we'll include that. The best one I've seen, though, is from Simon Jackman, a professor of political science at Stanford, and he says it's a system of laws or norms mandating that enfranchised citizens turn out to vote, often accompanied by penalties for noncompliance. Notice he says often, so it doesn't necessarily have to include penalties for noncompliance. And then in addition to that definition, the overall article that he writes is this lengthy encyclopedia entry about like all the different forms of compulsory voting that literally goes into the International Encyclopedia of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And I think this is a good definition, particularly for the AFF, because it really shows the breadth and the scope of all the different kinds of compulsory voting. Some of them are strictly enforced, some of them are not enforced, some of them have penalties, some of them don't have penalties. And as the AFF, you want to be able to do that, particularly if you believe you can run a plan or an advocacy. You want to have a broad definition of compulsory voting where you say there's a million different kinds, as long as what I'm advocating for falls within that larger scope, right? It is legitimate, it's topical, it's fair game. So the Simon Jackman definition gives you that incredibly broad definition and lets you have the leeway to pick which way you want to go as the AFF. Right? And I think that's probably the right approach. And then the last definition would be ought. I don't think there's a whole lot to debate about here. Every time I see a resolution with the word ought in it, I typically run into some debater who makes the argument that ought implies a moral obligation, and because it's a moral obligation, you don't have to explain how it would happen. I still don't understand that argument. I don't know why people think that the morality of doing something is not affected by whether it's doable. Like if you try to do something and you know it will crash and burn, I think that affects the morality of what you're doing. On the contrary, Immanuel Kant is famous for asserting that ought implies can, that you have to show that you can do it. At the end of the day, I don't think either of these positions matters all that much, because it's not like we're asking these countries to do something that's impossible. We're not asking them to build colonies on Mars or to extend human lifespan to 120 years. We're asking them to mandate voting and have some fairly minor penalties if you don't. Dozens of countries already do this, right? So it's not like it's super difficult. So I don't think the ought implies can debate really matters all that much. But those are the basic issues on framework and definitions. So now let's move on quickly and talk a little bit about values and criteria. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about values and criteria. If you've seen the channel before, you probably know that on values, I am a believer in playing it kind of close to the vest. I don't believe in being super creative. I think values like justice, morality, and societal welfare are usually the strongest. And the reason for that is the value in a Lincoln Douglas case is supposed to be the thing that we can all agree that, if achieved, is a good thing. That's the whole point of having a value. You're saying this is our North Star, right? This is the thing that if I can link to it, then we should all agree that I have met my burden, right? So if you get creative with that, if you start using all these sort of esoteric ideas that people disagree with and might not think are necessarily good, you're just giving yourself one more place to be attacked, right? So I believe things that could almost never be questioned in terms of their goodness, like justice, morality, societal welfare, those are the things you want to use in the value slot on the case, and you can be creative in other areas. So I know there are people who disagree and have some great advice on that, and feel free to run it that way if you want, but that's sort of the way I approach it. The place for a little more creativity, though, will be on the criterion side, right? And in terms of criterion, I think most resolutions, and this one is no exception, have a basic division on like what type you can pick, right? The simplest is going to be what we call a utilitarian standard, right? A utilitarian standard being we're going to look at measurable outcomes in the world. We're just going to see if does this side or that side of the resolution make the world a better place and make people happier in some measurable way. And then the other one would be the deontological approach, where we sort of say, no, we're not just counting up like dollars. We're not just counting up policy outcomes. There is some factor, there is some achievement or whatever that is just intrinsically good on its own. It's something we should try to achieve for its own sake, right? And we're going to look at both of those. So on the utilitarian side, I do think that the simplest way for most lay judges to be made to believe that compulsory voting is good or bad is to just point to the outcomes, right? Point to things like, if you're on the AFF, greater participation, greater representation for marginalized groups, less corruption, maybe even policy outcomes. If you're on the negative, taking away individual liberty, cost, wasting people's time, ineffectiveness, things like that. That's probably the simplest approach and the approach that a lot of people are going to default to. And so if you do that, you're going to be looking to your standard utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and you're going to be asking some permutation of the basic question, which of these positions, compulsory voting or not compulsory voting, yields the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Pretty simple, right? There is one important division to consider, though, and that is whether to use what we call act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. And this really matters depending on which side of the debate that you're on, right? So if you're on the affirmative, I'm going to suggest you really want to make sure that you're running some version of rule utilitarianism, and let me explain why. Act utilitarianism implies that every time we make a moral choice, like as an individual, right, we get to run the utilitarian calculus anew. So every time I make a choice as an individual, I should be doing utilitarianism to ask if the thing I'm doing right now is good, right? Well, if you do that with compulsory voting, there's a strong implication that like act utilitarianism implies that the voter should be able to make a utilitarian decision on whether to go vote. And that's kind of antithetical to compulsory voting, right? There are actually some arguments we'll talk about later when we're on the negative that there's a pretty strong economic argument that it might not be economically rational for you as an individual to go vote. It might be a waste of your time. It might not be worth it to you, right? And the whole idea that you get a choice is antithetical to compulsory voting. So if you're on the AF, you want to run something called rule utilitarianism. And this is where we look at the greatest good for the greatest number calculus in terms of like which rule for society as a whole will be best for everyone, which one will maximize their well-being. And in that case, you can argue that having a general rule of compulsory voting is going to lead to all these better outcomes overall, and we have to make the decision on a societal level collectively, not on the individual level. So you want to be very careful about that. Now, if you're the negative, you like the idea of, sort of individual utilitarianism, of making the decision in every case. You like the idea of saying each individual person, when they wake up on election day, should ask themselves, is it worth my time to go and vote in an election where I almost certainly will not affect the outcome and have to give up this time and stand out in the cold? You love that idea, right, as the negative. So using act utilitarianism there is probably a good idea. Now, if you don't go the utilitarian route, there are some deontological options, just basically saying this is good because it's good. There are so many, that you could run that we could never list them all, but just a few interesting ideas. So on the pro, one idea I like is the idea of what is called, and this is not like a specific theory, but I'm going to refer to it as like democratic representativeness, right? This is achieving accurate, unbiased representations in elections. In other words, having the election accurately represent the people in the country where the election is happening, right? There's a very good summary of this in a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article that we're going to link to. And there's also a very good brief article on it by Annabelle Lever from the London School of Economics in 2009, which we will also link to. But the basic argument here is that, look, it's just inherently better if you were a democracy, if your democratic elections actually reflect the will of the people that make the country up, right? And if, to have that happen, right, you have to avoid significant disparities in who votes and who doesn't. So we don't have to like say that, well, not just having, rich people vote is good because it leads to a higher GDP. It's inherently good if poor people and rich people all vote because it's just a more democratic country. I don't have to link it to a higher GDP. I don't have to link it to anything else. That's if you're doing a democracy, it's just inherently good, right? And then as we'll talk about when we get to the AF, there's plenty of evidence of disparities based on race, based on income, based on socioeconomic class that pervade who is voting and who is not. And getting rid of those is valuable in and of itself, even if it doesn't have massive changes in the policy outcomes, because that's what you're trying to do, right, when you do a democracy. And I think that's one good option that you can have, as the affirmative right. Another good option for the affirmative would be communitarianism. Communitarianism is a sort of moral and political theory that was popularized in the 1980s as a response to sort of liberalism's focus on the individual and like autonomy and strict separation and people doing, kind of whatever they like and maximizing their own welfare. Communitarianism focuses on the mutual obligations that societies have to individuals, but also the obligations that individuals have to society. And it kind of focuses on like establishing shared moral norms between people as opposed to like hard and fast legal rules. So for example, like communitarians would point to things like establishing a general consensus of private businesses, individuals, and government that like smoking in public is bad, right? And that would be an illustration of how communitarianism establishes joint shared values about what is okay and what is not, as opposed to like strict legal rules, right? And you could use communitarianism as sort of the criterion to advocate for a sort of soft form of compulsory voting, right? One with like very weak or non-existent enforcement. And you could just say, what we're looking to do here is we're looking to establish a community norm, a community understanding that voting is important. And yes, we'll pass a law that says you should do it, but we don't necessarily have to have draconian penalties. It's more important that we establish this general norm within the community, within institutions and individuals, that we all accept that it's important, right? Something along those lines, like jury duty, like registering for selective service. And this would be a nice way to sort of dodge some of the more technical questions, like how exactly are you going to enforce this? How exactly will you force people to the polls? And what a communitarian would say is, you're missing the point, right? The point isn't that we beat people over the head to get 100% of the people to the polls. The point is that we establish this norm in the community and people start to gradually accept it more and more, that they have this civic duty to vote. And if we miss a few people and if we don't get everybody there, that's not the point. The point is we establish the norm and the rule and we get more people to the poll as a result of that. And if you want to learn more about communitarianism, I'm going to link to a nice summary by an author called Amitai Etzioni. You may have heard of him before, and he has a good description of it there. But I think it's a nice kind of way to sidestep some of the practical questions. And then lastly, if you're on the negative, one obvious way to approach it from a criterion perspective is to use a sort of libertarian personal autonomy type theory, right? And we could sit here all day talking about different versions of libertarianism and different versions of like arguments about individual autonomy, but they all have similar roots. Basically, the idea that one person cannot legitimately be coerced to become like the servant of another person or another idea, right? You can be prevented from harming other people, like doing things to hurt other people, but you can't be sort of conscripted to be a servant in, a larger project that you want to engage, that other people want to engage in. And the notion is sort of rooted in this idea called self-ownership. And this is kind of ascribed to a guy named Robert Nozick from Harvard. although many others have used it as well. And the basic idea is, look, you own yourself, right? And you have a right to use your person, your body, your property, how you want, as long as you're not harming other people. And nobody can compel you to use those things, to use yourself for their benefit or for the benefit of some ideal that they like without your voluntary consent. Right? Now, obviously, this has some limitations. There are some extreme examples of it, but it gives you a nice sort of curveball position you can take in Lincoln Douglas, right? Many affirmative debaters are not prepared for it. It lets you sort of give them an additional burden. They come in with all these reasons why compulsory voting is great and it'll make the world better. And you say, whoa, 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 hold on. Before we talk about why this is so great, when did you establish that it is okay for one person or even a group of people to use another person, to require them to take some action or do some labor in service of them? Because I am rejecting that is ever acceptable. I think an individual owns him or herself and can never be conscripted for those purposes, right? Before you can even get to all that good stuff that you're going to accomplish, you need to tell me why it's okay to tell a person how they have to what they have to do affirmatively to aid another person or cause. And they'll say, well, are you opposed to jury duty and like the military draft? And you can absolutely say, yes, I am. I think we should pay jurors. I think we should have voluntary jurors. I think we should have professional jurors. I don't think we should have a military draft. I am categorically opposed to the idea of having people be sort of conscripted and drafted to do things against their will. And we'll drop a link to a good Stanford article that sort of summarizes a lot of the basic ideas of libertarianism. It is something you have to sort of come up with on your own. I'm not going to give you like the specific cards on how to run libertarianism on this particular resolution, but it's a good approach that sort of hits the affirmative with like, oh, well, I didn't even think about that. Why do I think that this is okay? And I think that's a good strategy to have. So those are some options for criteria. And I think with that, we'll move on to the most important part in this resolution, which is the substantive arguments on the AFF and then on the negative. Okay, so on the affirmative, before we get to the substantive arguments, I think probably the single most important thing I can give you, probably more valuable than everything else I'll say on this particular side of the debate, is to give you one source that everybody watching this needs to go and actively read, not just look at, but actively read. And that is a paper from the Brookings Institution and Harvard in 2020 called Lift Every Voice. And this is a 63-page, I guess, sort of manifesto slash study slash summary of the arguments in favor of compulsory voting. It is sort of a 63-page like mega cheat sheet on really every major argument you can think of for the AFF. Well written, well phrased, obviously from two extremely credible sources in the Brookings Institution and Harvard. It is mandatory reading for the AFF. It also contains preemptive responses to some of the most common arguments against compulsory voting. So it's great for going in and looking for blocks. It has lengthy discussions of things like, for example, freedom of speech and the right not to speak, logistical issues, things along those lines. It is rather lengthy, and I could sit here for the entire time of the video just reading to you from it, but that wouldn't do you any good. Broadly speaking on this channel, we try not to just come out and give you sort of pre-written cards and pre-written blocks, but to give you ideas that you can use to go and build your own case around. And I think in this particular case, there's not going to be a better example of where you need to go than the Brookings-Harvard paper. I'll probably call it the Brookings-Harvard paper from now on. But do go make sure you take a look at that, download it as soon as you're done watching this video, and start reading on it, because it's going to make you a much better debater. It's going to give you some great ideas. So that probably by itself is worth the price of admission, which, by the way, is zero because this is free on this video. But make sure you do that. So with that, I want to jump into the substantive arguments. And the first one I want to talk about is kind of a preemptive argument that I think everybody on the AFF needs to be ready for, which is you need to have some kind of argument that compulsory voting is actually going to lead to better outcomes for the disadvantaged, right? So back in 2013, if I remember correctly, and I think I do, one very common argument that I remember seeing from negatives on this was that it doesn't matter how much you improve turnout, and you're going to have all of these statistics about how turnout has gone up dramatically in places like Australia and other places. And yes, that is almost a given, and we'll certainly drop some statistics and notes about how turnout does increase substantially when you have compulsory voting. Of course it would, right? But all the turnout in the world doesn't matter if it doesn't link to actual changes in the outcomes for like real people people in the real world, if it doesn't lead to changes in electoral outcomes, if it doesn't lead to changes in policy outcomes that are markedly better for whatever group you're talking about, presumably for underrepresented, disenfranchised, marginalized groups, right? So you have to have something like that. If it's not in your case, it has to be in your first line blocks. So one example is there's a card that we noted, which is the Fowler 2013 card, and Fowler looks at Australia's implementation of compulsory voting and finds two things. The first one is that compulsory voting, in certain state assembly elections led to a 24% increase in voter turnout and a 7 to 10% point increase in vote shares for the Labor Party. Now, why does that matter? Well, sort of like the Democratic Party in the United States, the Labor Party in Australia is going to be seen as kind of the party of the people, the party of lower income folks, working class folks, blue collar folks, things along those lines. So seeing an increase in their share in the election is going to be something that you could look at as a proxy for being more responsive, right, to the needs of working class, historically marginalized groups, right? And then he looks at it on the national level and finds that when you compare Australia to other OECD countries, their adoption of compulsory voting led them to not only increase voter turnout, but also increase pension spending. And here again, pension spending isn't a perfect metric. It's not a metric we would use in every case, but it is a proxy for spending on the social needs of the least advantaged, right? Wealthy people don't need public pensions as much as people who are middle and lower income. So this was seen as being a measurable proxy for improving outcomes for working class people. Now, are there other examples of the needle being moved on policy? Yes, we're going to link to some of them. We'll probably pop some of them up in visuals if we can. But you need to make sure you have a few of those in your back pocket, because the simplest critique that you could get from the negative would be just, well, this is all great, glad you increased turnout, but if you're not leading to some measurable outcome, then why are we doing this? We're just burdening people with one more thing to do, and we have nothing to show for it. So be sure you're ready for that, either in the case or in your blocks. Turning to kind of a more theoretical argument, I think, one of the really important things that most affirmatives are probably going to want to have in their case, and this does come from the Brookings-Harvard 2020 paper, is the idea that you can't have true consent of the governed when you have chronically habitually low voter turnout, right? And so what that study notes is that the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the idea was to give Black Americans and others the unfettered right to vote. But since then, we have seen turnout for presidential elections hover around 57% for presidential elections and 41% for off-year midterm elections, right? And so what that means is that for the most important office in the country, the President of the United States, even a candidate that wins a decisive victory is typically receiving votes from only about 30% of the population. And as we'll talk about in a minute, it's not even like a randomly selected 30% of the population. It's a 30% of the population that tends to skew, broadly speaking, toward higher incomes and being, frankly, a wider portion of the population. So if you really believe that a democracy is supposed to be representative of the people who comprise it, right, saying that the most important official, even in the best of times, is only being voted for by 30% of the eligible voters, not even all the people, but just the eligible voters, and that says nothing about like disenfranchisement of like felons and things like that. That means that you don't really have a strong reflection of the mandate or the true consent of the governed. Most people are not participating in the process, and it's very hard to say that you have, a manifestation or a signal of the consent of the people who are governing. You have a lot of people who feel that there's just no reason for them to participate, right? In addition to that, I think it's important to point out, like I said, that these small numbers of people who turn out for elections are not it would be one thing if they were a random but representative sample of society as a whole, but they're not, right? They are systemically skewed to be wealthier, right? To be more affluent and to be whiter, and less diverse than the population as a whole. So the Annabelle Lever piece from 2009, Annabelle Lever is a fantastic source on this from the London School of Economics in 2009. This is from Great Britain. And by the way, a lot of the sources we're looking at in the video are going to be from the United States, but I think it is important that you have in your repertoire, in your case, and in some of your blocks, some data that comes from other countries, because this is not limited to the United States, and you don't want to be accused of having all your evidence from the U.S. I think much of the evidence will be about either the countries like, for example, Australia and other countries that do this, and projections about the United States in terms of the problems, right? But what Lever points out is in the last two general elections before this publication in 2009, in Britain, the participation gap between manual and non-manual workers, blue collar and non-blue collar workers, more than doubled. It went from 5% gap in 1997 to an 11% gap in 2005. Likewise, between the 1960s and 2005, the difference in turnout between the top and bottom quartile of earners, the richest and the poorest, right, went from a 7% gap to a 13% gap. So what we're seeing is that the gaps in who actually is able to show up and vote, right, between the rich and poor are significant, and they're getting bigger in Great Britain. And she talks about how gaps, for example, between college educated and non-college educated people in the United States are big and getting bigger, and you can certainly find other evidence on these economic disparities. And I think that's an important part of the case for why the status quo is not acceptable. Lever also talks about, in some of her other articles about disparities based on race. And we'll certainly put up, data based on that. But it is abundantly clear that in countries like the United States, white voters are more likely to be at the polls, and the body of people that's voting is not going to be representative ethnically of like what the country is. And this, according to Lever and others, kind of creates a vicious circle, which is, the people who would want to reform these things are the people who are not showing up to the polls, which means there's no incentive for politicians to reform them. And so the solvency becomes forcing politicians to solve this by sort of what I say, throwing your hat over the fence, right? If you as the judge use your fiat power in this round, you have this one opportunity, judge, to make compulsory voting the law of the land in democracies, not just in the United States, but in all democracies, right? Then these politicians who previously had no incentive to solve problems of access to the polls will now they'll be forced to. You throw your hat over the fence, you've got to find a way over the fence to get it. It's an old saying, I'm an old person, but the idea is once you've thrown it over, you're compelled to get over the obstacle. And by having compulsory voting, everybody has to go to the polls. Well, at this point, politicians are going to have to solve the problem, right? On a related note, not just talking about like the difficulty of access to the polls, but we know that in the United States, active voter suppression is a real problem. Not just from, groups who try to use misinformation, and not just from groups that try to, mislead people, but also from the government itself. In 2013, the Supreme Court got rid of some pivotal protections in the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. And since then, we have seen attacks on the ability to vote, particularly of people in minority communities. North Carolina passes a voter suppression bill that eliminates same-day voter registration. 14 states implement new voting restrictions for the first time in the 2016 presidential election. More polling places are closed. It's more and more difficult for people who are not already in advantaged positions to actually get out and vote. No real efforts made, for example, to improve transportation or accessibility to the polls. So voter suppression is a really serious problem. And the idea, according to multiple sources that you'll see, throughout the video, is that universal, compulsory voting is going to ensure that we have to sort of roll back these. Voter suppression would be pointless, right? The idea of trying to get, fewer people to the polls, like conservatives who use voter ID laws to try to intimidate people who, don't have government issued IDs. Well, that would be a thing of the past, because, we would have to find a way to get everyone an ID, because they would all have an obligation to go to the polls, right? And so it would be it would make less sense to even try to do voter suppression, and it would make much more sense to try to actively remove barriers like transportation, potentially making election day, a national holiday, having businesses be closed and things along those lines. You would throw your hat over the fence, and you would have to try to solve the problem, right? A way of explaining this, I think, from a theoretical perspective is, and I really like this comes from Chapman 2018, is to explain that the reason we need compulsory voting is because the lack of participation is what we call a collective action problem. And this is a really good theoretical, I think, explanation for why compulsory voting is necessary. So in economic theory, right, a collective action problem is a situation where it's very clear that a group of people would benefit if they all took some action together, but nobody benefits from doing it on their own, right? In fact, it might hurt you if you do it on your own. So for example, you might say, if we all convert to renewable energy and reduce our emissions, that will mitigate climate change. It will save lives. It will save us a bunch of money. You can cite statistics about that. But if only I, Brett Harvey, go out and I say I'm going to convert my whole house to solar panels, well, that's not going to have a big impact on climate change, and it's going to cost me a whole lot of money. So to solve a problem like climate change, you have to have laws that force everybody to go together at the same time and make the changes that need to be made, and in the long run, they'll benefit from it. And the same thing is true with voting, right? Members of marginalized communities in particular can rationally say, there's no reason for me to voluntarily go vote. There is a minuscule chance that my vote will be the deciding factor in the election, right? It's almost impossible, right? But if there were some mechanism to require everybody to get together and go to the polls together, that does have a significant likelihood of influencing the election. And that's what's called a collective action problem requires a collective solution, right? So Chapman 2018 says this: by promoting reliable compliance with the expectation of universal electoral participation, effectively enforced compulsory voting remedies the collective action problem that plagues vulnerable communities with chronically low turnout rates. Members of politically alienated groups have more reason to regard their votes as an instrument of political influence if they know that others like them will also vote, right? And by the way, this is a really good direct answer to some of the rational choice theory things that we see from the negative that we'll talk about later, which say that, like, you have a rational reason not to vote, it's not worth it to you, the likely improvement to your life is so low that it's not worth the time it takes to vote. And the response is, of course that's true on an individual level, right? Of course that's the same that's true with me putting solar panels on my house to stop climate change. It doesn't make sense for one person to do it, but it makes a ton of sense for everybody to do it. And that's exactly why we need compulsory voting, right? Because it doesn't make rational sense for an individual, but it makes sense for everybody. And this is a really good sort of logical theoretical explanation to the judge, and it's an answer to, like, why can't we just do this through other things? Like, why can't we just encourage, have more transportation and maybe have pay people some money to buy gas and maybe have a holiday, right? And the answer is, number one, if that were going to happen, it would have already happened, right? And it isn't happening in the status quo. We've seen, calls for this for decades, and they just don't actually come to fruition in many places. But number two, even if those encouraging steps did happen, unless you can guarantee that enough people will go with you, a person can say, well, okay, you gave me transportation to the polls, you gave me the day off, but still the chances of me influencing this election, right, with the outcome are 1 in a million. It still doesn't make sense for me to go. And that's the reason why other approaches and just making it more accessible is not enough. We have to make it compulsory, because that's the only way that it's rational for a person to think that their participation will matter, or for their participation to matter. And then sort of the last point, I think, major point that I have on the affirmative is that compulsory voting actually improves the quality of political discourse. It doesn't just lead to better outcomes, it leads to a better political process, right? So, what I had written down, these are my notes. Compulsory voting makes campaigns address serious issues. Political parties currently devote most of their resources, or many of their resources, to so-called get out the vote efforts, right? And these are not designed to persuade people, they're not designed to address substantive issues, they're just designed to make sure that the people that already agree with you get out to the polls, right? So Donald Trump, for example, you look at his polling numbers, they are steadily in the low 40s, but there's a decent chance as we sit here, in the fall of 2020, many people think there's a very decent chance he'll win re-election because he is so good at getting the people who do agree with him out to the polls, right? And this involves trying to whip up enthusiasm among the people that agree with you, but it also involves political attack ads to try to sort of depress turnout on the other side, right? To use polarizing issues like abortion and class warfare and politicians' personal lives to make people just not want to go to the polls at all. That's a big part of what, political ads are. Just get more of your people out and make their other side feel depressed and stay home. And as former White House Budget Director Peter Orszag noted in June 2012, compulsory voting would change this. Turn out the vote efforts, which are often bankrolled by big money groups, would become irrelevant. You have no reason to go around trying to turn out the vote because everybody's going to turn out to vote, or very nearly everybody, a lot of people, right? Negative advertising would be much, much less effective because in many cases what negative advertising, the central aim is not to switch your view, right? So for example, a negative ad by Joe Biden about Donald Trump, the idea is not so much to get you to vote for Joe Biden, it's to just make you feel, less enthusiastic about Donald Trump and get you to not go to the polls. Joe Biden knows you're probably not going to go from being a Republican to being a Democrat, but you might go from being a Republican voter to a non-voter. That's what negative advertisement is for, right? And the argument would be that if you couldn't get people to not show up, there'd be much less reason to do that. There'd be much more reason to focus on substantive issues, right? So those are some of the general ideas on the affirmative side. Now let's take a minute and take a look at the negative side. Okay, so on the negative, back when I was first coaching on this topic, working with some high school students back in 2013, if you'd asked me, I think I probably would have said that the affirmative had the stronger position by a pretty considerable margin. But the more research I've done this time around, I think I've come around to the view that the negative is actually in a little bit better strategic position. Particularly among like when you have a round between like two strong debaters who are very strategic about it. And I'll talk a little bit about why. It's not an overwhelming advantage. I think it's a very balanced topic, but I think it is a notable one, right? So I want to run through about 5 or 6 different sort of types of arguments that the negative can run just sort of broadly. So the first one is going to be the same thing we talked about when we started the app, which is the question of whether compulsory voting actually achieves any measurable changes to policy outcomes or to electoral outcomes, right? With the idea being, and that this being a strong angle of attack, with the negative saying, look, we'll stipulate you're going to raise turnout. When you force people to do something, of course, many people will go ahead and do it. The question is, does it actually change the results? Because if it doesn't, you're just wasting people's time. Yes, you're getting a lot of people to go stand out in the cold and vote, but it doesn't mean anything because it's not changing outcomes in their lives. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a really good summary of the issue of just sort of the morality and ethics of voting, and in particular about the morality and ethics of compulsory voting. And it has a pretty good paragraph-long summary. It sort of says that there's a lot of evidence. For example, political scientists have also been unable to demonstrate that compulsory voting leads to more egalitarian or left-leaning outcomes. The empirical literature so far shows that compulsory voting gets citizens to vote, but it's not clear it does much else. So this is a pretty good summary of at least some of the literature. It's not universal like we talked about earlier, but let me give you a few examples of folks who don't find results. So Hoog and Mary in 2011 say that it has no impact on election outcomes. They say that research has shown with regard to partisan preferences, there are no significant differences between the preferences of voters and non-voters in compulsory voting systems. Right? Put differently, compulsory voting systems do not seem to affect the results of the various parties competing in an election. So what they're basically saying is that, whatever the partisan breakdown is between Republican, Democrat, Labor and Conservative, whatever, right? It seems to be roughly the same between the group of people who votes and the people who don't. So bringing all the non-voters in, has more votes, but it doesn't result in a change in the electoral outcomes. That's what their conclusion was. Hoffman and others in 2016 say that there's no overall change on spending or on social spending. And they look at disaggregated state spending from 1980 to 2012. I believe this is in Australia. I could be wrong about that. But after they control for a bunch of factors, they find, in particular, our empirical results show that neither the amount of state-level spending nor the share of this budget devoted to administrative welfare or infrastructure spending significantly changed with the introduction or removal of compulsory voting. Now, spending is not a perfect proxy for anything. It's not always the case that spending means that you have a better outcome. But generally speaking, there is a belief that greater government spending tends to benefit the least advantaged. You tax the wealthy more, you spend it on social programs to help the poor. And Hoffman and these others are saying there's no link between compulsory voting and any change on that. There's another article from Brookie in 2009, and I believe Brookie was like an undergraduate when this was written, but it's still an interesting thing. And it says, again, there's no increase in government spending. And he says he ran a test on the effect of compulsory voting laws that they have on government revenue of 109 nations that did and didn't have it, which is a pretty broad sample. Who knows if the methodology is perfect, and the data held that there's no significant relationship between government revenue and compulsory voting. So here again, you do compulsory voting, you don't do compulsory voting. It doesn't mean you're taxing people more. It doesn't mean you're going after sort of more government spending. Are these perfect representations? No, but they do suggest that there's just not a whole lot going on at a policy level. And if you really want to get broad, and you would have to do some of your own work on this, but one thing I did just sort of as an original research thing was I looked at the UN Development Index rankings of countries that do have compulsory votings and countries that don't. And this is very broad, but like one thing you can say is like, look, if compulsory voting is not making life better for people, like the UN Development Index rankings is one of the sort of the most broad omnibus rankings of like how good a country is. And one thing you can do is if you look at it, and I'm not certain that this is the case, but I think if you look at that, you'll find that the scatter pattern of your compulsory voting countries, right, is going to be all over the place. They're not going to be like aggregated at the top as being like materially better than others. And of course, some of them come from lower income areas of the world, but they're not going to even necessarily be like higher than their peers within the region. So, I just did one example. I just said, let's compare them to the US, which does not have, obviously, compulsory voting. And so on the rankings, the United States ranked 15th, right? And so there were three countries that have compulsory voting ahead of us, which is Switzerland, Australia, and Singapore. And then there were 13 behind us, with countries like Turkey, Ecuador, and Fiji being 98th. So it seems as though, compulsory voting, yes, there are some countries that are doing very well with it, and there are many countries that are doing really poorly, right? There doesn't seem to be strong evidence that this leads to a better, more developed, more egalitarian, more progressive anything. And using the UN Development Index might be one way to do it. You can substitute your own favorite statistics, but there's a lot of room here for original research and creativity, where you come in with your own like homemade stat, as long as you're rigorous about it, about like, look, here's all the countries that do this. They don't seem to be doing any better than their peers, right? And there's not much your opponent can say if you've been rigorous about looking at that, right? Another angle, if you're not going to stick specifically to, sort of policy outcomes, is about the individual's rational self-interest. And this is a really good argument if you're going with a libertarian angle, which is that like individuals ought to be free to do what is in their own, best interest. And in many cases, there is strong rational evidence that it is not in their best interest to vote. And this comes from a field of behavioral theory called rational choice theory, which sort of tries to understand decision making based on what would be in an individual's rational self-interest, right? And again, it pairs well with libertarianism, maybe using Robert Nozick and things like that. But it is explained really well in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I would suggest you look at it. And it explains like basically this. It gives you a sample individual named Sally, right? And it says, suppose Sally's goal is to change the outcome of the election between two major candidates. In that case, the expected value of her vote represents the difference in the expected value of the two candidates, and C, in other words, the cost, represents the opportunity cost of voting. In short, the value of Sally's vote is the value of the difference between the two candidates discounted by her chance of being decisive in the election, minus the opportunity cost of voting. And what it says is that basically what this boils down to is that voting is like buying a lottery ticket. The likelihood that you will be the deciding vote, that you will change the outcome, is so low that it's always going to exceed the opportunity cost of like what you could do with that morning, being productive at work, staying, going out and having a bagel and reading the paper, hanging out at the house and playing video games, things like that. It's going to be irrational to vote. So there's an article from Feddersen 2004 that expounds on this, right? And we're going to give a link to it. But it basically boils down this way. If you as a voter have a 1 in 10 million chance of changing the outcome of an election, which is actually probably an overstatement of your chances, and we'll give you some source, Feddersen talks about that, right? But let's say you have a 1 in 10 million chance of changing the outcome of the election, and you think that like candidate A will make you $10,000 better off than candidate B, right? So then what you would do is you divide your $10,000 benefit from having candidate A win by the chances of you being the decisive person, which is 1 in 10 million. And what you get is the expected value of your vote. So the expected value of your vote is going to be 1/1000th of a dollar or 1/10 of a cent, right? So if you divide $10,000 worth of benefit, and that you'd have to really believe a candidate was great to think they were going to benefit you by $10,000, and then you divide it by your 1 in 10 million chance, and you'd see that it's like 1/10 of 1 cent is the value of you going to vote. And so if you lose anything worth that much money, and it's kind of hard to say, like, what is a morning of productive work worth? What is a morning of relaxation worth? What is a morning of going out and walking your dog worth? I don't know, but I think most people would say it's worth more than 1/10 of 1 cent, right? Anything you could do with your morning is worth more than that. So that's just kind of an example. It's sort of my illustration of the Feddersen article, that there's a strong argument, right, that it's not in your rational self-interest. And if you pair this with either libertarianism or utilitarianism, the argument would be you can't force people to do something that doesn't benefit them, right? Now, to be fair, earlier we talked about how the answer is that compulsory voting is solving a collective action problem, and it's making it so everyone goes, and then it is more rational, right? But this is an argument that people ought to be able to spend their morning or spend their day doing what benefits them the most. They shouldn't be compelled to do something that has a tiny, tiny, tiny expected benefit to them, right? Another argument is that compulsory voting, and I really do like this one, and I think this provides sort of a critical angle on the debate, and one that is very important, is the idea that compulsory voting dehumanizes individuals or maybe denies them autonomy by compelling them to express consent to governments that they disagree with, right? Or compelling them to express a consent to what they consider unjust governments. So Trevor Burrus in 2015 makes the argument this way. He says the First Amendment protects not just the right to speak, but the right to refrain from speaking. In 1943, the Supreme Court held that Jehovah's Witnesses students couldn't be forced to salute the flag or say the Pledge of Allegiance. Other court cases have upheld the right to be free from forced speech in the context of compulsory union dues and other things. So isn't voting a form of speech, right? Now, and more specifically, isn't not voting a form of speech? And he says that not voting can certainly communicate a variety of messages, such as dissatisfaction, being fed up with the two-party system, being an anarchist, right? Things along those lines. And it may be a crude method, according to him, but it is absolutely a form of expression. And the Supreme Court, and I will say courts in other countries, have recognized this right not to be compelled to speak, right? Now, one could respond and say, well, you're not being compelled to pick a particular candidate because you can always cast a none of the above ballot. But I think the way you would frame this argument is, I'm not saying that I have to pick a particular candidate. I'm saying I am being forced to get up and show up at the poll or in some way participate in the act of voting. And I think that the act of voting is something I don't want to do. I want to express myself saying, I think that this government is illegitimate. I think that this process is illegitimate. And there are a fair number of people who don't just dislike Trump and don't just dislike Biden, right? They dislike the idea of American democracy. They think the electoral process is fundamentally ineffective, and should they be compelled to voice their assent by participating in it, right? And in particular, I think what it does is it denies people the autonomy of withholding their votes as an expressive tool, a speech tool for political leverage. And there is a fantastic article in The Guardian from the UK in April 2020 called "I Ain't Voting Till Black Lives Matter." And it talks about American activist Walter Newsom, who is an activist whose campaign is to encourage Black Americans to withhold their votes as a tool to force politicians to address issues affecting Black people before they will give their votes to them, right? And I'm just going to read to you from this because I think the message, I can't do a better job by paraphrasing it. So what it says is, Black Americans have been loyal to Democrats for years. Since 1964, Democratic presidential candidates have received at least 80% of the Black vote. However, as Princeton political scientist Paul Freimer describes, this loyalty can devalue the concerns of Blacks and give swing voters more power. When Democrats talk to gay people, they got marriage equality. When Dems talk to immigrant communities, they got DACA. But when it is Black people, we just get jive talk in the electric slide, said Newsom, a 42-year-old founder of Black Lives Matter of Greater New York. While Newsom is an outlier, he's not alone in encouraging Black people to hold their votes for ransom. In 1924, in the shadow of strict loyalty to the Republican Party following the American Civil War, activist James Weldon Johnson asked, how can the Negro expect any worthwhile consideration for his vote as long as politicians are always reasonably sure how it will be cast? In 1965, months before the Democrats would secure the Black vote for generations with the Voting Rights Act, Malcolm X implored Blacks to treat their ballots like bullets and only use them when the target was within reach. And I'm going to read you where that message came from. Malcolm X had a good speech about voting called "The Ballot or the Bullet," and here's what he said. The political philosophy of Black nationalism means that the Black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community no more. The Black man in the Black community has to be re-educated into the science of politics so he will know what politics is supposed to bring him in return. Don't be throwing out any ballots. A ballot is like a bullet. You don't throw your ballots until you see a target, and if that target is not within your reach, you keep your ballot in your pocket, right? And what you can do is you can expand this argument, I think a very strong critical argument, by looking at statistics about how the Democratic Party arguably takes the votes of Black Americans for granted. And the basic idea can be applied in many other democracies where many other marginalized and disenfranchised groups basically only have one party they can look to. They can't look to like the Conservative Party or whatever. There's only one party or at least one wing of politics that's going to be responsive to them. So the only tool they really have for having influence within that party, African Americans are not going to show up and vote majority for Trump. They're just not. They're not going to vote majority majority for the Republican Party. That's not plausibly going to happen in any election. So the way that they have real leverage in an election is turnout. It's how many people show up. So if Hillary Clinton only gets 59% turnout among African Americans, as opposed to Obama getting 67%, that's enough for Hillary Clinton to lose the election. And compulsory voting takes the leverage of turnout away. If you're not willing as an African American to walk and vote for a Republican, which most are not, right, then if you're forced to show up at the polls, the leverage of turnout goes away, right? The leverage of I'm not voting until Black Lives Matter and Walter Newsom, they don't have that leverage anymore. They just effectively are coerced to show up and vote. Right now, I guess in theory you could cast a protest ballot and say none of the above, but that puts the burden on like organizers to like persuade you to do that, when arguably the burden should be on the politicians to inspire you enough to show up to vote. So I think this is a very, very strong response to the idea that compulsory voting empowers disenfranchised communities to say, no, it doesn't. It actively takes away the one piece of leverage that they actually have. If you think African Americans are taken for granted by the Democratic Party now, just wait until they are actively forced to go vote every time and cannot deny the Democratic Party turnout to have leverage over them. Then you will absolutely see the Democratic Party go and worry about swing voters, worry more about white voters, worry more about people who are in the center of the political spectrum who are on the fence, as opposed to their most loyal voters who will now have even less of a voice than they've ever had in the past. And I think this is a mighty strong argument if you can frame it, and I think it's one that's pretty hard to respond to. And I would be pleased to see a negative debater run it well in a round that I was judging. So it'd be interesting to watch. Another argument that I think is really important is the idea that compulsory voting requires uninterested and potentially uninformed voters to try to chart the course of national policy. And, kind of an amusing statistic that I saw in a case, I don't have this poll anymore, but I saw this in a case and I remember writing it down, and I actually found it, was on one of my flows. According to a 2010 Newsweek poll, 21% of Americans believe that witches and warlocks are real. 20% can't say for certain whether the earth revolves around the sun or vice versa, and 40% can't name the three branches of government, right? And you can find other amusing examples in the United States and other places of people who just don't know what's going on. It's kind of scare the judge into saying we've got a lot of people who don't know what's happening, right? But as as Piero Moraro wrote in 2012, arguably there might be an ethical obligation for some people not to vote, right? If you don't have an interest in political issues and you're not paying attention, the argument would be it's morally wrong for you to go assert control over politics if you don't know what's going on. If you don't know how to fly a plane, it's morally wrong for you to run up to the cockpit and grab the stick and try to fly the thing, right? And it's morally wrong to try to influence politics if you don't know what's going on. There was this really good article. I haven't been able to find a new version of this, but this was around back in 2013. This was a Pew Research poll that actually compared the knowledge of registered voters versus non-voters. In other words, people who were not registered to vote. And it found that like 72% knew the answers to questions like, is Mitt Romney pro-choice or pro-life? Well, being a Republican, he's pro-life, right? Non-voters averaged just 49% correct answers, with 23% of non-voters unable to identify which party, with only 23% of non-voters able to say which party actually controlled the House of Representatives in an election for the House of Representatives, right? And you can look at examples in this slide here about the differences in knowledge between people over just basic issues of where the candidates stand, what they believe in. And the idea is if people aren't interested, I wouldn't want somebody who doesn't know anything about football to be forced to help me draft and have equal say in drafting my fantasy football team. You wouldn't want somebody who's uninterested in debate to be forced to be your co-equal partner in writing your debate case. So why do we think that we want to have people who are not interested in politics be, participate in something that they don't care about? And it's probably better to frame it in terms of a lack of interest, right? A lack of caring rather than a lack of knowledge, because that can start to sound kind of classist and elitist, particularly coming from you smart kids, with your suits and your laptops, some of you coming from these fine schools. But people who don't care, this slide that we showed earlier shows that if they don't care, they're likely to not know the basic issues in the election. So do we really want to trust the outcome of the election in those cases to people who are just not interested enough to keep up? So those are my thoughts on the negative. I think overall it has some really strong strategic positions that I wasn't aware of before I kind of started researching for this time around. So with that, let's move and talk about some final thoughts. Final thoughts, very simple. To start the year, I'm going to give the same message I give because some of you may be relatively new debaters. I don't think any of you are brand new because we have the novice topic. But be able to provide a very clear, simple roadmap at the end of the debate for what matters and what doesn't, right? On this topic, there are a lot of different angles that you can take, right? You can take a very utilitarian angle. You can take an angle that is more critical. You can take angles that emphasize turnout, that emphasize policy outcomes. Be able to tell the judge in very simple terms what matters and what doesn't, and be able to tell them a simple story of why compulsory voting is going to solve particular problems in a practical way. It solves collective action problems, right? Or it does nothing. It achieves no outcome whatsoever and just creates an illusion. But be able to tell that story at the end of the debate very coherently and very concisely. I know I say it all the time, but debaters who are clear, simple storytellers, even in circuits that are more high speed, even in circuits that are more technical, trust me, judges want a clear, simple message on why they win. So know what your story is, not just, rehashing, impacts from earlier, but telling a clear, simple story. Beyond that, as I said earlier, be ready to be as effective as you can in talking to that camera in online debate. Know the rules of the particular tournament. Don't get caught flat-footed, with something you weren't prepared for. But other than that, you guys, I'm sure, are going to do a fantastic job with it. Again, sorry we were a little late with this. Kind of had to do this one at night while I was doing other things during the day. We will have our full cast together next time, and I'm sure we'll have a really good time with that one. But until then, I hope you guys have a great first couple of weeks, first couple of months of the season. And so we'll close with our usual, which is remember to always work hard, have fun, and hail state.